Good morning, Epic Church. It is good to be with you this morning. Normally, I don't get to see you guys, but I'm excited to being here. I'm over at the Eagle campus, but when I'm done today speaking, I need to run over there and be with the body over there as well. So I just say, they say to tell you all, hello. So today is actually a really exciting day because one of our church plants in the Greenhouse Network is launching this morning. They actually launched at 10 o'clock. Luis and Maria Torres started the mix, and I am excited about just the group of people that they're going to be reaching there in the Lansing area. So if you just be praying for them in their launch, they are meeting right now exactly the same time we are too. So like I said, I'm really, really excited about their journey together and reaching those people. Well, we're in our series called At the Movies, and one of my top favorite movies of all time that I love is this movie called Remember the Titans. Has anybody ever seen that movie before? It is one of my favorite movies, but here's the premise of the movie. It takes place in 1971 in a town called, or in a state, I should say, called Virginia. And it is this one school system that had to integrate white and African-American students for the very first time. Riots are breaking out, fights are breaking out because nobody wants to integrate the school or the people within the school. And so people are actually fighting with each other. But really what it's about this football team that had to make this integration work together, where they had to take the white athletes and the African-American athletes on the same team together. There's fights that are breaking out on the team, but under the leadership of Herman Boone, who is the African-American coach, he actually brings unity to the team, and by the time that the movie is almost over, unity starts to happen within the city that this school is located in. The topic that I want to talk about today that is so prevalent within our society, within our culture, is reconciling racism and prejudices. And that's because partly is racism and prejudices are a part of every single one of our stories, some form or another, whether it be directly, indirectly, whatever it is, it's a part of my story. It's a part of my story from my grandparents who were in the Ukraine and the difficulties that they had to go through living in that country. It's from my growing up in my family environment where there was some prejudice communication that was in messages that were given to me within that environment. From being and living in Chattanooga, Tennessee in the early 90s where there was a massive racial divide within that city. Of coming back or going to Rochester in my first job, I was the only white person on staff in an all African-American church in the inner city and also at the mission. Of my wife and I starting a church in St. John's just north of Lansing called Pathway Church, where our church was labeled not only the cult church, for some odd reason new churches are called that, I don't know why, but we were known as a church that would accept anybody. And that's what we were known as from some of the people in the town because of the different races that are a part of our church. Racism and prejudices are a part of every single one of our stories, from our little town in Portland to going to national, Colin Kaepernick and the whole Nike story, to even going global. It's a part of our world. But it wasn't just part of our story, and it's not just a part of our context here. It's also a part of Jesus' context back in the day when he was doing ministry. If you have your Bibles or your Bible apps, if you would, turn to Luke chapter 10. And this is a really, really powerful story. We've heard this story many different times, and it's a story about this guy who Jesus is having a very unique conversation about. And in the story, it's this expert of the law who stands up and he wants to test Jesus. And he says, Jesus, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And I love how Jesus normally responds. What does he do? He responds back with a question to the guy. He says, well, what's written in the law? I love that question because it's almost as if Jesus is saying, dude, you're the expert. How about you tell me, right? And so the guy responds back and he says, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus is like, you answered right. Now go and do it. But the guy doesn't want to stop there. He actually asks a very pointed, clarifying question. And what is that question? Let's pick it up in verse 29 of chapter 10. Here's what he says. So this man wanted to justify himself, this expert in the law. So he asked Jesus, what does he ask him? Who is my neighbor? What is this guy really asking? This guy is asking, Jesus, who is it that I exactly need to love? Please tell me. Jesus, I want to know, who should I love? Should I love the uneducated guy? Because you know I'm educated. I really don't want to be with that uneducated person. Do I need to love someone who looks weird, Jesus? Do I have to love them too? Do I have to love someone who has a different music style than I do? Because you know my music style is so good, that country music style, not so good. All you country fans out there, right? I know, I'm sorry. This guy's like maybe saying, Jesus, do I need to love someone with a different accent? Jesus, do I need to love someone who has a different language or maybe has a different skin color? Jesus, should I love that person? Please tell me, Jesus, because there's a certain group of people that I want to love. But tell me, am I doing the right thing by just loving them alone? And I love what Jesus does. He brings out a story which we know as the Good Samaritan story. And here's the thing I don't want us to miss in this story. Jesus doesn't share who to love, but Jesus tells us how to love. Jesus doesn't share who to love. He tells us how we should love other people. And here's what he says in the Good Samaritan story. Let's just unpack this just for a brief moment. And so Jesus replies and he says, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho. When he fell into the hands of robbers, they stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side, so too a Levite. When he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. Let's stop here for a moment. Here's this guy, and Jesus actually says a man. I don't think that is a coincidence. I think Jesus is saying, who's the man in your life or the woman in your life that is needing of help? But in this day and age, it's probably a Jew who got beat up on the side of the road, was robbed, left half dead. A priest and a Levite, people who associate themselves with the church, what do? They come up to this guy and they pass by on the other side of this guy, and they kept on walking past. Now, Jesus is the next three words Jesus shares is going to be the most shocking words that this audience will probably hear. And here's what he says. He says this, but a what? But a Samaritan. Why is this shocking to the audience for Jesus? See, Samaritans are hated by Jews. The Jews hate Samaritans, and the Samaritans hate the Jews. And this has been a hatred that's been going on for over 700 years. 700 years that this hatred has been going on. Why 700 years? Well, back in the Old Testament, when the Jews were in exile and they were released from exile, most of the Jews would go back to their homeland, and some of the Jews would stay there. And so the Jews would marry someone of a different race. They would marry someone of different religion. And so their kids now are what they call mixed race. The Jews would call these Samaritans half-bloods because they were no longer full Jew, and they could no longer associate with Jewish people. And so here's Jesus, who in this context, what the Jews would typically do, if they wanted to get somewhere in that culture and they had to go through Samaria, instead of going through Samaria where the Samaritans were, they would actually walk around, take the long road because they hated them that much. And so Jesus says, but a Samaritan. Look what he says. He continues on. As he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went on to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 silver coins and gave them the innkeeper. Looking after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. And Jesus says, which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus said, then go and do it. Here's a guy who goes over and he sees this wounded individual. He puts him on his donkey, brings him over to a hotel. He completely pays for everything, takes care of this guy. And if you look at the story, here is a guy who has been immersed in history of hatred for over 700 years. And what he does is that he takes the hatred, he puts it aside of what he was immersed in, the messages that he received, the prejudices that he was given, maybe when he grew up, and he said, I will love this man. I will love him. Dr. Martin Luther King said this in one of his famous speeches. He said this, the first question the priest and the Levite asked, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? See, here's these guys who are all focused on themselves. If they say, if I cross this divide, what will other people think about me? But Dr. King continued on, and he said this, but the Good Samaritan reversed the question, and he said this, if I do not stop and help this man, what will happen to him? Gang, this is the heart of the gospel. This is the heart of Jesus right here. If you like taking notes, or if you like even taking mental notes, write this down. Racism and prejudice is not a skin issue, it's not a social issue, it's not a relational issue, but it's a sin issue. And I think we need to be honest and call it what it is. It's a sin issue. James 2:9. James says this, if you show favoritism, what does he say? You what? You sin. You sin. And so I believe, as I said before, man, I have a limited perspective on this topic. But I believe that God has called the church to be a part of the solution. And today I want to share with you what are some of the solutions that we can actually have within the church and our culture. And so, again, if you like taking notes, I want to talk about three things this morning that we can start doing as a church and as Christ followers of Jesus that we can start doing. Number one, I believe that we need to recognize our prejudices. This is hard to do, isn't it? Because we can't just look in a mirror and be like, yep, that's what it is. Because oftentimes we feel justified in our own mind of how we feel towards someone else. Or we try to justify our actions to make them right, of however we feel about someone else. But what is a prejudice anyways? See, a prejudice means to prejudge. And it's a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. And so I want to share this video clip with you. As I said, I love Remember the Titans. It's in the very beginning of the movie. And it's about, there's these, just before school starts, riots are already happening, fights are already happening, and everything that's going on because of this forced integration. And there's some of the white athletes and the white coaching staff that's about to meet Herman Boone, the African-American coach, for the very first time. And here is their response to meeting this individual for the first time.
Herman Boone, I'm the new assistant coach. Well, from the looks of things, I'd say we got about all the help we need around here. Why ain't you outside there with all your little friends hollering? This was the time that was arranged for me to meet with Coach Yost. I never miss an appointment. Well, maybe you just better reschedule. Coach Boone's school board made the decision to put you on my staff. I did not hire you. Well, I came up here to coach at GW. I didn't ask the schools to redistrict. I didn't ask to be assigned to your staff, so I guess we're both in a situation we don't want to be in. But I can guarantee you this, Coach. Come to win.
Here's these individuals who are meeting Coach for the first time, and they had no experience whatsoever with Herman Boone, didn't know his story, didn't know anything about him, but yet here's their response prior to meeting him for the first time. I would, if we were honest with ourselves, I would probably bet to say that every single one of us grew up with some form of message or prejudice that we actually received. I just want to be honest with my story. My grandfather and my grandmother and my two aunts were in the Ukraine. And when they were in the Ukraine, they wanted to, during World War II, they wanted to escape the Ukraine because the Russians were coming in to invade. And so they decided to jump in a covered wagon for a whole year, and they lived in this covered wagon going from the Ukraine, and they traveled over to Poland. And in Poland, they were picked up by the Germans, and they were thrown into concentration camps called Dachau. And they were in there for quite some time, and during that time, my grandfather developed a very, very deep-rooted hatred towards people, but especially towards people that were different than him. When I came along, and I would spend a lot of time with my grandparents, and my grandfather specifically, which was quite a bit of time, my grandfather would always tell me this: don't trust anyone because they're out to get you. And he would go down a list of races that he would say, don't trust these people. And he told me that since I was a kid until the day that he passed away. And I'm just being honest with my story, that it became ingrained into my own life that whenever I came across someone that was different than me, I felt this anxiety and nervousness rising up inside of my own heart that I would tell myself, I don't trust you. I don't trust you because you're going to do something to hurt me. I don't trust you. And God had to do a major, major surgery in my heart to rip out this prejudice and this message in my life so that I could see people how God sees people. Loved. Maybe for you, you grew up in an environment where there's a message that you received or there's a prejudice that you received. Whatever it might be. It could be anything. And I think the list is numerous. What is that message? What are the prejudices that you have in your life? What does that look like for you? Because I believe we have got to be honest and acknowledge the prejudices that we have in our life. Which leads us to the second thing that I believe that God calls us as a church. Seek to understand others. Seek to understand others. And here's one of the things that I believe, as I told you before, I have a very limited perspective on this topic, but one of the things that I believe that God has called us to do, and especially me to do, is get to know someone else's story, especially with their stories that they have experienced, different things that I have experienced. And here's what I believe that we need to do. We have got to suspend judgment in hearing the person's story and just listen to them. And just listen to them. That's hard to do. I want to share this other video clip that from Remember the Titans. It's about the team was actually winning games and they were undefeated at this point. And Sunshine, who is one of their white teammates, is hanging out with some of the African American teammates, and he invites them into this restaurant that he wants to pay for, and they're trying to explain to him, this is probably not a good idea. So listen carefully.
Look here, man, all right? This here Virginia, all right? They got problems with, they don't want to listen. No.
Oh, man, that's history, bro. It's on me. Come on.
We're full tonight, boys.
What? There's tables all over the place, man. What are you talking about?
Well, this is my establishment. I reserve the right to refuse service to anybody. Yeah, that means you too, hippie boy. Now, y'all want something to eat, you can take these boys out back and pick it up from the kitchen.
What I tell you, man?
Petey, man.
I didn't know, man.
I told you what you mean you didn't know. You think I was playing with you? He didn't know, Petey. Blue, he don't want to know.
When you pull some crap like that, you better be able to back it up.
Man, let's go, man. Cool out. Cool out.
Let's go, Red.
Let's go, man. Man, let's go. What kind of man acting a fool tonight, man? Petey. Man, we even talk to that man, man. He acting all crazy and stuff, man. It don't make no sense.
I think that's one of those powerful clips because it is very difficult to suspend judgment when we're having conversations with people, isn't it? when we suspend judgment, because oftentimes what we typically do going into any form of conversation or any environment, whatever it might be, is that we come in with this lens or this filter to what we want to filter conversations through, and we don't hear the whole story of what is really happening. And I believe that God has called us to seek to understand someone's story, to seek to understand where they've come from, what they have done, but to really seek this last thing that I just want to, I believe for us, that God has called us to start doing as a church and again continually do, is this, is to show love to people who are even different than us. Show love to people who are different than us. Love them deeply. Love them from the heart. Because this is what made the Samaritan person set aside 700 years of hatred and stop for the person that was on the side of the road, is the love that he had for him, even though he was probably hated by him. There's a story that happened not too far from here in a town called Ann Arbor, almost in our backyard. And in Ann Arbor, there was this rally that was going on, and it was a KKK rally. But then there was also protesters that were coming to protest a rally, and so the police knew that there was going to be some tension that was going to be happening. So they created this barrier and boundary between the two parties. There's a guy by the name of Albert who was part of the KKK rally, where he was wearing a Confederate flag and he had a white supremacist tattoo, and he broke through the barrier to the other side. And some of the protesters saw him break through, and they screamed to him, "Kill the Nazi! Kill the Nazi!" And so they started to wail on this guy and to beat this guy and just beat on him. And this 18-year-old girl by the name of Keisha Thomas saw what was going on, and she threw herself on the body of Albert that was a part of this rally. And here's a picture of this right here. And she threw herself on the body just to protect this guy from the blows from the other people. What would cause a person to do this? And when they asked her, faith actually played a huge part for her. And this is what she said. She said this: "I knew what it was like to be hurt. The many times that it happened, I wish someone would have stood up for me." I think we can all understand what it's like to be hurt in some form of fashion. And it drove her to protect this guy, even though it was someone who was against them. And she threw herself on the body just to protect him. Gang, I believe as a church, we need to really understand and recognize our own prejudices that we do have. Seek to understand someone else's story, but here's this: show love. Show decency, show honor, show grace, show love. Because again, that's why the Samaritan person stopped. If you like taking notes again, or even mental notes, here's the thing. Racism and prejudice is not only the presence of hatred, it's also the absence of love. Also the absence of love. I want to share this last video clip with you, and then we're going to close with showing a music video, which was the reason why that I came to wanting to talk about this. But it's a video clip about Gary and Julius that in the very beginning of the movie, they actually roomed together. Gary is the white teammate. Julius was the African-American teammate, and they roomed together, and there was a fight that broke out because they just didn't understand each other. But as they got to know each other's story, as they got to get immersed and work together on the same team, they actually developed this amazing friendship, and it was just really cool to see how that progressed throughout the movie. But in the scene that I want to show you, that Gary is in the hospital, on a hospital bed because he got in a car accident and is paralyzed from the waist down, and Julius heard about it, and he goes to the hospital, and he meets and he sees his mom that's there, and just apologizes and just crying for Gary because of what happened. And so Julius is about to walk into the hospital room, and I want to share with you just this clip because of how reconciliation in a relationship can really happen. Listen carefully. Probably one of my favorite clips of the movie because I love to see how reconciliation takes place within a relationship. All because you seek to understand someone else and you show love towards that person, and in time, reconciliation does happen. Does it happen in every single relationship in instances? No, it doesn't. But what God calls us to do as a church is to continually show love, is to continually be recognized where it is in our life that we are showing certain prejudices in our own life. So let me ask you this morning, what are some of the prejudices that you have in your life? What are some of those for you? And let me ask this question. How is God calling you to love those people in your life? How is God calling you to love those people in your life? And so I want to share this music video, and we're going to close with this music video. And this is one of the reasons why that I wanted to share this. I had something completely different planned for this morning. And I really felt as I was driving in my car, God said to me, Steve, this is not what I want you to talk about. I want you to talk about something else. And I'm like, God, what do you want me to talk about? But he never responded. You love those moments, right? And so I'm like, God, what do you want me to do? Because I'm one of those, I love to prepare in advance, and it wasn't coming. And I was driving in my car. This song came up. It's called, it's by the group for King and Country. Never heard of them before until that song popped up. My wife just threw it into my playlist on my Spotify account. Gotta love that too, of how God shows up. But the song came up, and God said, that's what I want you to talk about. And I'll be honest, I told God, I was like, I don't even know what to say. What do I say? And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to share this with you, because God was pointing to certain things in my life to say, this are the prejudices in your life. Now go and love them. Love those people. Love them with all your heart. That's why I want to ask you those two questions to think about while we watch this music video, and then the band will close.